Welcome to Top Shelf Word Salad, where Ben and Jason talk about books, music, movies, and media of all sorts. Anyway, so what do you think of the book?
Okay, so
Ta-da!
you've got it. My copy's on the shelf. All I did was listen to it. I made it through twice, like 2 times, and then I just randomly listened to chapters as I was walking. So probably 2.25 times.
Nice.
I liked it a lot. The book was fascinating, super engaging, but it's a challenging book.
It is.
And I think it's challenging because I think it's in the middle of this emerging science of psychology in the mid 20th century. So if you don't know a lot about Jung or Freud or analytical psychology or depth psychology, I'm not even sure I know what those things are. So there's a lot that's specialized. I think that's easy to get lost in.
Yeah, but I mean, it's also like you can pick up so much from it. Just for what, and by the way, we should probably say the name of the book.
Oh yeah,
Origins and History of Consciousness by Erich Neumann.
Erich Neumann,
with an introduction by Carl Jung.
And he was a student of Jung's.
Yep.
And Jung wrote the foreword, right? You just said
yeah.
That.
Yeah. Yeah, it came out in 1949.
Yeah.
But as far as the why did we decide to read this angle, for me, like I read it in college, and then I heard Jordan Peterson talk about it when he and Camille Paglia had a little sit down, and then of course there's the Carl Jung connection.
Yeah. So just an extension of what you had studied or what you had heard from other people. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember you and I having a conversation a couple of months ago, and we were talking about Herodotus and Thucydides and the prose transition developing in ancient Greece. And I continue to be amazed that we have these two like comprehensive historical authors that basically are writing at the exact same moment in time in classical Athens, but they and starting a new tradition. And I think we were saying, that's the first time people were trying to record things that actually happened. And prior to that, you had the Iliad and the Odyssey and that tradition, which was rooted in mythology. And then prior to that, you pretty much have nothing. And so I think then you mentioned this book because it kind of, it spells out that arc from nothing in terms of consciousness to a fully developed,
right.
How you can read the mythologies and how they relate to the evolution of consciousness. And then, he even talks about the modern romance as the extension of that in the book. So, so this is it was like a perfect fill to that conversation, which is, we went from nothing. Like we have seen that we've gone from nothing to having a very rich storytelling and prose nonfiction tradition, and it's all happened pretty quickly.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting to think too that the Iliad and the Odyssey basically are two stories that have their tendrils that go back into time far enough that they disappear, and that's kind of where he's coming from in terms of consciousness.
Yeah.
And having that, the mythology of the time basically be something of a kind of mirror for consciousness to not only see itself in, but get to know itself in a way.
Yeah, it's because those those books come down from a history of storytelling before writing. And there's all kinds of scholarship about how what you have is kind of Bronze Age, Greek civilizations, beginning those stories, but there are obviously overlays in the intervening kind of darker ages, before classical Greece. So it's this mishmash of original story, probably original motif, and then all of these details that are clearly from, a time in between the Bronze Age and classical times.
Yeah. Yeah.
The accumulation of this kind of stuff, also similar to when he talks about consciousness. It's like it's an accumulative process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's there are definitely like portions of the book. Like for me, the first half, part one, is kind of it's a mythology overload. You know, after a while, I kind of glaze over and like, okay, this is another thing about ancient Egypt. You know,
Yeah.
and I it's not that I don't care. It's just that I don't know. My attention span has become fatigued.
Yeah.
But
and it can in this book especially because it's so dense. I mean, it's thorough. And I guess we should say that the just about the structure of the book. So the first part you were just talking about is basically the evolution of consciousness as it appears in the mythology of the peoples of the world as they've evolved, right? And so it's looking at all the mythological motifs comparatively across all kinds of cultures and times, and picking up on the commonalities to draw out his basic story, his basic hierarchy of development. And then part two is the individual's development of their conscious throughout their lifetime. Right.
Yeah.
And I think his fundamental thesis is that the two parts really mirror each other and go through the same stages.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely love that aspect,
Yeah.
like the history of people and the way they've told themselves history being a parallel to the history of the person and the way the person develops themselves and tells themselves their own story over time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, that was the thing I struggled with right out of the box was kind of related to that. So first of all, it's a very convenient thesis to set up. It's well balanced. It's nice. It's like, okay, we can see that it would make a great story, but there was something within me that just had a hard time buying in, especially at first. And I really struggled probably for the first third of the first part. And I didn't know why. I was reading and I kept finding myself like, nah, that can't be right. I'm not so sure about that. And I think the reason I've come to the conclusion, the reason I was struggling is that, I've always had this conception about humans as being essentially fixed consciously, intellectually, like basically you or I would be the same person 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. We would just be in a different culture and society and set of circumstances, and that if there was somehow that you or I could go have dinner with somebody from ancient Egypt in the third dynasty or something, we would be able to do, like, we would be able to exchange ideas and we would think the same way. And so if you have that idea, then the ideas in this book, right, are going to conflict with that, because this book is really saying that's not the case. What it's saying is this consciousness develops, slowly as we evolve, and the upshot is that you wouldn't have a chance of being on the same wavelength as somebody else that long ago or in a different setting like that. And so I mean, he hammers the point home enough that I finally was like, every time I would try to put forth some challenge to it, I couldn't really articulate the challenge very well. You know what I mean?
That's a good way to put it. I totally know what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, because some of it kind of seems like, why... My computer just went down here. Like he's making assertions that seem hard to substantiate or hard to really put down as like, okay, this is the way this is. Well, wait a minute, right? But eventually it kind of does weave this web that seems, plausible, let's say.
Yeah.
For the actual... I mean, even in the foreword, Jung, what did he say? That he said it was a unique history of the evolution of consciousness.
Yeah. So for example, I guess just to finish off what I was saying, that one example of a challenge would be, I always my thought was, we had these stories that were passed down. We're storytellers. We just didn't have the instruments to convey the stories. We didn't have writing. We didn't have an oral tradition until a certain point. And so my challenge is, well, no, we would have had the same level of consciousness. It was just we didn't have the technology to carry those ideas and stories forward. But then when you step back and think about that, that's kind of his point. It's like if you haven't developed writing or your language isn't developed to that point, that's a sign that the consciousness hasn't either. So I just kept coming across those things, and I'm like, I this is fundamentally changing the way that I think about, the last 100 to 400,000 years of just evolution. Like, I've spent a lot of time thinking about that shit. Like, that's a big deal to me.
Yeah, right. It's interesting stuff. You can easily get lost in it, and it's kind of like the what I was saying about the consciousness coming to know itself by self-reflection.
Yeah.
All those technologies allow for like different facets in the kind of many faceted mirror of self-reflection. So like it isn't just like what you can hold in your my computer keeps making my I wonder if this is getting recorded. It just starts, my image starts, it just froze. Well, yeah, no, it's okay. Kind of. We have a series of bulleted points to hit. So the first one is mythology as a repository for the development of human consciousness. That's basically what we were just saying,
Yeah.
But,
and that's basically part one, right?
Mm-hmm,
That's
yeah. That's how he sets the stage. And I love that he, I think a lot of people would start a book like this with, hope that's not too loud. The heat just kicked on. A lot of people start a book like this by starting with the individual and going to the larger,
Yeah.
where, it makes so much sense that he started with the larger context, because that's what he's saying, condensed down, created the individual, which was then capable of seeing the larger context, and then this almost like kind of, if you imagine like mirrors set up against each other. I keep using mirrors as a, but it, then you kind of get something of a type. It's almost like consciousness as feedback.
Well, yeah, when we start to think about how we're thinking, like that's
exactly
where it gets where it gets trippy, hard to orient myself in, like that's and there are many places in this book that are like that.
Oh yeah.
You're like,
totally dizzying,
And just the big headline concept. So mythology. So the idea is that these mythologies and the stories that are in them have commonalities across time and culture, and all the range of stories, and they do. And again, it was something I kind of struggled with at first, because it's like, are you cherry picking certain things that seem like they fit your thesis, or is this something that's like a real deal? So the Uroboros, right? Is this that's the circle, the figure
first
of the snake
stage.
eating itself, right?
Right. Yeah.
And he goes through examples from different times and cultures about the appearance of this image, and you think, well, I could see people independently stumbling onto this. Like a circle is like a very appealing symbol, and the snake eating itself would be kind of a cool paradox kind of thing. But I think he gives enough examples of it turning up, like in the Americas,
in Mayan culture,
way back when, and like and across the ancient world, that you just and it's the same thing. It's like, well, okay, if this image is popping up, who am I to argue that it's not like a common archetypal type image? Like, let's go with it.
Yeah.
let's I buy it.
Yeah, totally.
So,
and it's a really solid example of an archetype.
yeah,
Because the idea of archetypes can be super slippery, really, sometimes. Because a lot of them, it can seem super simplistic, like with the mother and the father archetype. Of course, but at the same time, that represents these kind of enormous categories, of thought. So, and development
Yeah.
of thought. So,
And so those, so I guess we should say too what they are, right? So he talks about the Uroboros, or the Uroboric stage, right,
right,
as the
yeah,
initial stage,
yeah,
which is followed by the
the,
Great Mother stage, the separation of
yeah,
the
of the
parents.
world parents, and then it's all like the various stages of the birth of the hero.
Yeah, the dragon fight, which I love
Right,
too, which
I do
is just, it's
too.
fantastic.
I do too, because it relates back to the Ouroboros. So,
Yeah,
I mean, I don't want to talk about this yet, but even his like concept of centroversion, um, the Ouroboros is also kind of represented by the circle, like
yeah,
which he also thinks of as the womb, which is also the kind of
the
perfect,
egg.
yeah, the
Yeah,
egg, and then the centroversion plays directly into that as
yeah,
well. So I mean, it's just like he just nestled so many ideas within each other that
yeah, for sure.
it's you can really see it from a lot of different angles.
So, so maybe we should talk about a centroversion on that list. I
Sure.
think it is, right? Yeah. So, I mean, that's a natural lead-in. So,
Yeah, yeah,
what's your,
yeah, yeah.
how does that strike you?
Uh, the basically the whole of something has the ability to create unity within its parts. I mean, that was his essential definition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You go ahead. You go ahead.
And and it's sort of like in this Ouroboros stage, there's no consciousness. It's all unconscious, and then there are these little pips like around that are sort of like the consciousness pops up, and then it just fades back in,
Yeah.
and it's learning, or it's adapting to kind of be its own thing eventually, its ego at the center. And so that's the centroversion plays a big
Mm-hmm.
role in that. It's kind of like it's almost regulating and directing the energy of the unconscious into this point, and then eventually, once the ego is formed and is placed at the center, right,
Mm-hmm.
of consciousness, then it seems like this centroversion function takes on this regulation between unconscious and conscious, like
Yeah.
the flow back and forth of whatever the contents are, the energy passing back and forth, which is kind of a fascinating idea, like
Yeah.
unconscious versus conscious, and the connection between them, because we as people, in at least in our society, I think we're so focused on conscious thought and action. I think we give very little heed to unconscious things and tend to dismiss them.
Mm-hmm. Just like how people, when they talk about dreams, they say, it was just a dream, whatever.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
and
let it go.
right, yeah, exactly. And consequently too, just in the society, then there are certain things that reinforce that idea, like in a movie, when at the end it's like, oh, it was just a dream. My initial thought is, fuck you. Why did I watch
Yeah.
this whole movie? For you to slap this cheap bullshit out at the end.
Yeah.
It's just
Oh, I agree with that. Yeah. And also, it's like just dreaming. Nobody talks about it, but we all do it every fucking night. Like,
right.
it's
Yeah.
kind of a miracle, and it's kind of amazing, and it just doesn't really seem to be that interesting to us.
I think that really reinforces the fact that it's not interesting to us. Generally, it's interesting to me, but that reinforces his kind of evolutionary outlay of consciousness coming from this kind of primitive, far less conscious state. And we retreat back into unconsciousness on a daily basis,
Yeah.
and have to, with or you'll basically break down.
Yeah.
So I kind of love that idea. And one thing and this is a super nerdy analogy, and I don't know enough about this stuff to really give it any kind of serious talk. But one thing it kind of reminded me of, or I thought of a lot while reading this, is that, if you can imagine a black hole, and the black hole gives off Hawking radiation, right? So all of the little virtual particles being split, one zipping into the hole and one like making it out alive, right?
Yeah.
It's like the virtual particles that make it out and give off the Hawking radiation are consciousness, and
Right.
and the black hole is the subconscious. Yeah.
Right. The thing you don't really, it's there, but you don't know anything about it.
Right. Yeah.
And
it sucks stuff in, and it's just like there's a kind of core mystery to the whole thing.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you. I
was going to say so something I was thinking of. This is a totally way more mundane example. Is I was talking to a friend who just got a dog, and they're training their dog, and it's like an 8-week program, and it's like there's all these steps to it. And he said to me, kind of in passing, well, what happens is as we go through these lessons with the dog gets really tired. Nothing physical is going on. It's learning things, right? Mm-hmm. And so I found myself thinking about that a lot as I was reading, because Neumann talks about like dawn man or primitive man, developing consciousness and getting exhausted by it to the point where they have to shrink back into the unconscious. And it's sort of like you think about a dog, and if you can see that happening in a dog, you got to be like, there had to be a stage in our development that was just like that.
That's great. That's really great. Because I think that's why we sleep every day. It's because like every 18 to 24 hours or whatever, you absolutely positively need 100%. A vacation from this shit. So this is directly from the book. Creative evolution of ego consciousness means that through a continuous process stretching over thousands of years, the conscious system has absorbed more and more unconscious contents and progressively extends its frontiers.
Right. So it's taking from the unconscious and it's bringing it into the conscious realm, which is making it stronger and more assertive.
Right.
And there's this thing about it's not necessarily a battle between consciousness and unconscious. It is at first in the formation of it, but because of centroversion and this regulation, it does become an interplay at some point when it's well developed.
Yeah, exactly. And by that process of self-reflection, you develop more of a conscious orientation to unconscious processes, which is to some extent, I think, the an awareness of sensory information as it comes in.
Yeah.
And then a kind of ordering of it, or at least ordering to the point that you can recall past examples of the same type of input and the reaction you had at that time. Whatever it may be. It's just a learning process, basically. Yeah, I have another quote here. So just one more. The unity of the whole is maintained by compensatory processes controlled by centroversion, with whose help the whole becomes a self-creative expanding system. So
and I think that's what you said at the very beginning. It's like the unity of the parts. It's like its function is to, what was the word you just? Compensatory. Right.
Yeah.
But
the
basically,
the word I blew
for the imbalances,
right. Yeah. Well, and then this brings us to the next point here, the idea of the unconscious and the unconscious and consciousness being female and male respectively.
Oh my God! So many people have reacted to this in such a negative way.
Right.
And because I think once you label consciousness as masculine, I think that it just invites all of this, modern political discussion
Totally.
into it, and probably especially if people like Jordan Peterson are recommending
Right,
this book, then you're like, well, how does that fit into his politics? I
Mm-hmm.
don't think there's ever an assertion that male is good, consciousness is more important than unconscious, therefore consciousness is good and unconscious is weak, and there's none of that sort of gender argument to it.
No,
I think it
not at
strikes
all.
people that way, but I think it's a very convenient way. It's a very convenient way to talk about the differences, but B, there seems to be a real change in the evolution of mankind, right, from this matriarchate into this patriarchate that seems to follow these lines of development, the way that he's drawn them out, to the extent that I think you have to talk about them in the way that he does.
I do too, and I know Camille Paglia would be completely on board with that. Right? That's a
Which
big
I don't
part
know
of,
much about her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This. Do you remember Carissa?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. A very good friend of mine for a while there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I saw her not too long ago. She's doing very well. She has a daughter and everything.
Oh, nice.
Anyway, yeah. She did a deep dive into sexual persona about Paglia's book when we were in college.
Yeah.
And honestly, that book for me at that time was too much. Like I can read it now, but that time it was like I just felt totally overwhelmed by it.
Yeah.
But yeah, she is absolutely on board with it. And a big part though of I think why people get upset with this stuff is they don't understand that in Jung's thing and in Neumann's thing, male and female is always in a certain element of balance in both men and women.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the whole anima animus thing.
Yep.
And how they relate to each other through the development in the individual is, again, like a representation of how male and female relate to each other in the society as it grows and expands and has its mythologies and ways of reflecting on itself.
Yep.
So there are all these parallels. So it isn't women like to sleep and men like to run around
Right.
and build
It's
stuff.
not that at all. and it's not like only men develop a strong consciousness. It's men and women develop a masculine consciousness and a feminine unconscious. That's
Right.
what everybody goes through,
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly it.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, that's actually just really quick. That's another quote I have from him here, where consciousness as such is masculine even in women, just as the unconscious is feminine in men.
Yeah. Right.
So, done. No need to be upset.
That's right. I mean, I guess I could understand having that reaction, but I was
Yeah, me too.
surprised because I've Googled a little bit about this book since we read it, and that's one of the big things that I see is just people like fighting against this idea, and
You have to not get it to be upset by it. I mean, and I'm not saying anybody's stupid. It's just that they haven't gone into it enough, where they have that. I think what happens is people read something, then they see something they don't like, they have this flashpoint of anger, and they throw the book at the wall.
yeah.
It's like, what? No, read the rest of the paragraph.
Right. There's more coming. Trust me.
Right. Yeah.
And that kind of leads me into another idea. So, and it's about kind of the matriarchate and the patriarchate. But is there anything else you want to say about just the sexuality or the sexual terms related to consciousness, unconsciousness before I go there?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the other thing I was saying before, it kind of follows the development of human societies. I think Neumann does a really thought-provoking and thorough job of describing what the evolution of our cultures might have looked like. And he goes from this place where it's just a hive. It's a group of people sort of not very aware of what's happening in their surroundings, probably responding mostly to the need to eat and then sleep because it took them so much energy to eat, and they're in these
sex.
small and to have sex and it's not And so in these smaller communities, but the community is the overriding thing. It has nothing to do with the individual, therefore that person's consciousness. And he describes like what would that look like if you are sort of in a society where your relationships are basically monogamous and you have life partners. Well, this means that everything's going to center around the female at first because it's the daughters, right? It's the mother, it's the daughters, and then it's the men coming from other groups into that group. And when they come in, they're likely not to be accepted to the same depth that everybody else is. But that you can kind of see how that would work out, right? And I think there are examples of it anthropologically when you look at hunter-gatherer societies.
Oh yeah.
But that's all like the early development, I mean, he even says at one point, if you were kind of marked out because you had more independent thought and you were more about the self than the community, a little bit more than everybody else, you probably were sort of a pariah. You probably were thought of as like just a weirdo. Like this one right here doesn't belong, and dismissed for it. It's the complete opposite of what I think you have in modern Western society. But if you think about that, so if I think there are compelling arguments that he makes, and then just through archaeology and just what we know about, ancient societies or what we guess about them. But then he uses Egypt, which I think is right, as a great example of how we can kind of see everything, not just the society becoming patriarchal, which it clearly does starting with the first dynasty, and it's very well documented, but also with the mythology. So all that stuff about Isis and Osiris and Set and Horus, and like the way that he traces the elements that you see in the current myths, you can actually piece apart the levels where the story was one that was told in a matriarchate originally, right? It's where Isis was this queen figure, and she's later subsumed into the
subservient,
right? Yeah, into the stories the patriarchate tells. Yep. And I think when he goes through that, it's super compelling. Like it just makes so much sense. But so that's my add-on to this idea about unconscious, conscious, female, male. Early societies naturally evolving around the woman, the great mother, right? And then that developing to a point where it separates enough that the conscious, male separation of the parents, winner of the dragon fight sort of takes over.
Right. Yeah. No, that's exactly it. Yeah.
I love it when he talks about that. I really thought he did a nice job on all that.
So then there's also the mana and Numa and Totem.
I don't.
So,
yeah. I'll let you take this one. I don't understand them, and I meant to research them more, but I didn't.
No. I did a little. I did, but it's definitely and these are things that he doesn't really do a good job of describing. He just starts talking about them.
Right. I agree.
And it's like, what did you just knock down here? What are you laying down here, Brother Neumann? It's like, but he's definitely at that point, I think, assuming that who's ever reading his book has a deep knowledge of analytical psychology and Jung's thing, which is unfortunate, but
yeah.
Well, with Newman or Numa, and every time I see the word Newman, I just think of the guy from Seinfeld. Newman. who the guy who played the exact same part in Jurassic Park.
Yep.
He was the same guy. Yep. He was just a brilliant coder in Jurassic Park.
Yeah. Looked the same, acted the same.
Same clothing.
Yeah.
Same slobbiness. Yeah. It's freaking great. But from what I can discern, the Numa or Newman is like the divine presence.
Okay.
So with that, I really hope that somebody who was writing for Seinfeld read this book and thought it would be hilarious to make Newman the divine presence.
In the early scripts, they spelled his name Numan.
And then the idea of the Numinous
Yeah.
is then kind of an extension that's like like or of the divine presence.
Yeah.
You know?
So if something is numinous, like how would you put that into words?
It's kind of like a little window into awe.
Okay.
Like a numinous presence would be something that like gave you a feeling of divine presence.
Yeah. Okay. That's well said.
Which would be to me synonymous with awe.
Yeah. That's good.
But yeah. And then the whole with the mana. I mean, that's such an incredibly. There's so many. I mean, there are different cultures that have this word and that it means different things. But I looked up. This is more from Jung, but let me find this. The mana personality. Now this is from Jung. The mana personality is a dominant of the collective unconscious, the well-known archetype of the mighty man in the form of hero, chief, magician, medicine man, saint, the ruler of men and spirits, the friend of God.
Okay.
I mean, I still have no idea what that.
Yeah.
It means someone who has personal power.
I think that's the word I was thinking of. Is so if Numa is the divineness of something, mana, to me maybe it's like the power of to assert that quality or another quality. But if you've got,
right.
I'm thinking of
Through
objects
the individual
that get kind of worshipped or idolized. They have both things. They have the Numa would be the divine part, but the mana would be the power to either radiate it or receive it or like make a connection
right.
with it, something like that.
Yeah. Which then it leads perfectly to the idea of the totem, which is kind of like, yet again there's this idea of like, okay, with this we have the Numa is the divine presence, and then the mana is the ability to kind of manifest that in an individual, and the totem is then the thinking outside the individual. That's why it's usually like an animal.
Yeah.
Like to then reflect back on the individual, to have that same type of feedback loop.
Right.
That develops the individual through time.
And that's it, and it's the feedback between the external and interior, right? Like so if you're walking around and you're looking at trees and you're not thinking, you're not like breaking them down, what type of tree is this, yada yada yada, you're just sort of recognizing there's a window in front of you and trees are passing by, and you can kind of get to a place where you feel energy and you can kind of feel a connection external to yourself, which is kind of what I feel like he's describing when he talks about that. Is as we're developing internally, we're actually responding to the external and bringing parts of it inside of us, and then vice versa, right?
Yeah.
And I think that so, and if when it comes to objects in our exterior world, that's they become reflections of what's inside of us, or we make them into that.
Yes. It's like we reflect our understanding of that object back toward the object.
Yeah.
And then you toy with reality to see, whether you're screwing shit up.
Right. Is that right? Or you walk around convinced for no good reason, and because there's never an argument to the contrary, that what you do and say and act, how you act around specific objects, has something to do with what's going to happen in the future. You feel like you control things. You didn't decide to do that. It just is like the opposite had never occurred to anybody.
Yeah, and then the culture can do that, right? The Earth is the center of the universe, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then somebody like Copernicus comes around, and Galileo, and back to your room, Galileo.
That's right. Yeah. Wait a second.
Stay there for the rest of your life. Yeah. Well, for the last section of our kind of outline here, it's just I have to admit I don't know how to pronounce this word. I've only read it.
Okay.
So I may be about to embarrass myself.
Go for it.
I'm gonna let the tension mount while I take a drink of this wine.
How many syllables? 4? 4 syllables.
No, it's the
little word.
Is it chthonic or chthonic?
Oh, chthonic. I don't know. It's gotta be German or something. Chthonic.
Right. Chthonic.
Yes. I don't remember what the whole question was, but I will say before you read it that I was super confused during that part.
Yeah.
Like he would talk about chthonic. I don't even know. Chthonic man versus like.
Right.
I don't even like the sun man or something. I don't know.
Right. Yep. That's it. That's like the ideas of like chthonic and solar consciousness.
Solar consciousness.
And you know any word that begins with CHTH just to me seems like somebody's decided to be mean with spelling. You know?
That's right. It's got to be a hard concept.
Right. Wow. But it basically means kind of subterranean, underground. And then so it's just again we're kind of underground being more subconsciously oriented and solar being more consciously oriented. Yeah. There's also just to go back to what we were saying earlier, he talks about how there are numerous. He made a number of different examples of cultures who associate the moon with the feminine, and that's also kind of the subterranean.
Yeah.
And then the sun with the male or masculine and more, obviously above ground.
Yeah.
So, which of course, makes perfect, very simplistic sense.
Yeah, it does.
And
it follows that. There is an idea that's well documented, and I think he does a good job of drawing it out, which is that the body image, the human body image, has an early place in our consciousness, and it's like the higher up it is, it almost. The higher up the seat of your consciousness is, it almost represents a more evolved consciousness.
Yeah.
And the lower down, right, an earlier stage.
Uh-huh.
And you said, so solar consciousness made me think of something else about this book that I love. There are all these phrases like that, like just like solar consciousness. And I wish I'd written some down, but they're just like, and he'll string them together, and it's almost like this flow of like Uroboric incest. You read that for the first time and you go, what the hell? Are we talking about incest all of a sudden? Like, what is this? And then he explains what it is, but then later on he'll reference it, and when he's talking about something else, and it just washes over me. Like I'm just like, it just feels like a really interesting like collection of syllables and like concepts and like and so in the book, the whole book, especially listening to it, I think really like has that extra element of like it's not poetic, it's just like it sings in a certain way.
It does. It really does. Well, and with Uroboric incest too, when I just can't help but think, okay, if it's Uroboric, it means the snake is eating its own tail. So if it's Uroboric incest, does that mean it's eating its own tail twice? Right. It's eating its own tail while eating a family member's own tail as well.
Yeah. I haven't seen an image for that one.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You'd need like the XYZ kind of plane thing happening.
Yeah, the spherical snake somehow eating itself.
Right. Yes. We need a really like talented and bitchin' topologist to come in and help us with that.
Oh, we should. Because if we could do it, we know that it's a primal archetype. I think it would catch on.
Yeah.
Oh, that reminds me of something else. Another huge impact this book had on me is that for my whole life I've wanted to get a tattoo. but I've never
Uh-huh.
been able to think of anything good enough to be permanently
Oh.
on me. And now I
Yeah.
know
I'm the same.
it's
Uh,
the Uroboros. I don't know
yeah.
which one.
Yeah.
I have to research them all, and I have to find the
Right.
exact right one. But that is going to be my tattoo. I have decided.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. I mean, that's perfect. Yeah. I've never been able to get a tattoo either.
No.
So with wrapping this up, what do you think? Thumbs up? You like
Thumbs
it?
up. Well, yeah,
As a
I
rating?
read it twice, 2.5 times or whatever. I probably
Yeah.
will again. It's in my Audible library, and I revisit that often. So
Yeah.
it's dense enough that there's more to learn each time you go through it. There's enough that it's connected to that I don't know enough about, that I've got other readings to do. Just to that will help in the future with it. But yeah, I absolutely loved it.
Yeah. 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 And if I if I had to quickly like summarize why someone should read it, I feel like it's a book that will give you will reorient you to how to think about your own development and the development of society, the society around you, and even just society period, back to the idea of we're all Africans kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it's yeah, I would recommend this book to anybody, anywhere.
Yeah, and maybe I'd say another reason somebody might want to read it, we didn't even get into, and it's super fascinating, is that he actually does spend some time on the implications for modern man, right? This crisis
Yes.
of consciousness, this idea of the consciousness and the ego being so strong that it actually starts to tear the whole thing apart. I mean, I believe
Right.
I believe he thought we were in that space in the 40s, and
Oh,
I
yeah.
can only imagine what someone like that would make of today. So there's it's not a ton of time that he spends on it, but I think it's enough that it's kind of interesting to let yourself think about what the implications might be or have been over the last 70 years or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, and yeah, just like historically speaking, I guess I should have said this more toward the beginning, but this came out in 1949, and he had left Germany much earlier, or maybe it was Switzerland. Sorry, I think it was Switzerland. But anyway, he ended up not being able to get his degree in medicine from the school he went to because he was Jewish.
Oh,
And he had to he just bailed out and went to Tel Aviv and just lived the rest of his life there. But so to think about how the idea of ego and the idea of like high level, I guess, condescension to the point that you are okay with exterminating people, right?
yeah.
Was so at the fore at that time that I can't even imagine how deeply he felt what you were just saying.
Yeah. Right.
I mean,
the context is so much different and
It's-
got to be more
yeah.
immediate.
Oh God,
To
it's just
him.
dire. Yeah,
Right?
yeah. As I mean, I'm sure there's going to be a great many people who will be very gifted in their reflections on this whole lockdown period that's worldwide for the COVID-19 stuff.
Yeah.
And there hasn't really been anything like that's been worldwide in its impact since World War II.
Right.
At least to the extent that it's in everybody's, it's affected everybody's daily life,
Yeah.
whether or not
Yeah. Worldwide,
COVID ends up being. Yeah.
that's the key.
Yep.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
Good. So
Podcast number 1.
it was pretty good. Nice talking
Yeah.
to you, of course.
Oh, of course, as always.
All right.
But yeah. All right, I'll just cut stuff here.
Okay.